The job of exhuming graves, often regarded with both fear and fascination, was a task John had grown accustomed to. Graveyards were places where most feared to tread after dark, but for John, it was simply part of his work. Along with his trusted assistants, Mike and Bill, John had earned a reputation as the best gravedigger in the region, a man who could handle even the most troubling graves, including those whispered to be haunted. But tonight felt different. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the graveyard as John led his men to their latest assignment, the exhumation of Emily's grave. Emily, a young woman who had died under mysterious circumstances, was said to have taken her own life after a broken engagement. Since her burial, her grave had become a place of legend. Villagers claimed to see her ghost wandering the cemetery at night, and whispers of her mournful cries echoed through the misty air. Emily's family had requested that her grave be moved, but the job had proven difficult. No one dared touch the grave, fearing the stories that surrounded her. Finally, in desperation, they had turned to John, trusting that his experience and bravery would see the task done. The night was unusually cold as they arrived at Fulwang Cemetery. The wind whistled through the trees, carrying with it a chill that sank into their bones. The graveyard was vast, with crooked tombstones casting long, jagged shadows under the pale moonlight. Mist rolled over the ground, thick and suffocating, making it hard to see more than a few feet in any direction. "Are you sure about this, John?" Mike asked, his voice barely above a whisper. His eyes darted nervously toward the surrounding graves, as if expecting something to emerge from the darkness. John didn't respond at first. His focus was on the task at hand. He had done this countless times before, disturbing old graves, digging through layers of earth, but something about Emily's grave felt different. There was an unnatural stillness in the air, as though the entire cemetery was watching them. "We're here to do a job," John finally said, gripping his shovel tightly. "Let's get to it." They began to dig, their shovels breaking the silence with each strike into the cold, damp earth. The air around them seemed to grow colder as they worked, their breath visible in the mist. John could feel the weight of the night pressing down on him, heavier than usual. He glanced at Mike and Bill, noticing their nervous glances and the way their hands trembled with each movement. As they dug deeper, a strange sound reached their ears, a faint whisper carried on the wind. It was soft at first, barely distinguishable from the rustling of leaves, but as the minutes passed, the whisper grew louder. It was a voice, indistinct but unmistakably human, as if someone was speaking just beyond the veil of the mist. "Did you hear that?" Bill asked, pausing mid-shovel. His eyes were wide with fear. Mike, too, had stopped digging, his face pale. It's nothing," he stammered, though his voice lacked conviction. "Just the wind." But John knew better. He had heard that sound before, the faint whispers of the dead. It wasn't uncommon in his line of work, but it never got easier. He motioned for them to continue digging, trying to shake off the growing sense of unease that gnawed at him. As they reached the coffin, the whispers ceased. The silence was sudden and absolute, as if the very air had been sucked from the cemetery. The three men stood frozen, their breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The coffin lay before them, old and weathered, yet oddly untouched by time. John knelt down, brushing the last of the dirt from the coffin's surface. His fingers traced the name engraved on the lid, Emily. For a moment he hesitated. He had been in this situation before, had opened countless coffins in his career, but something about this grave made his skin crawl. He glanced at Mike and Bill, both of whom were staring at the coffin with wide eyes, their fear palpable. Taking a deep breath, John placed his hands on the lid and began to lift it. The wood creaked as it opened, and a sudden rush of cold air swept over them, sending a shiver down their spines. Inside, Emily lay perfectly preserved. Her skin was pale, her long black hair spread out around her face like a dark halo. Her eyes were closed, her lips slightly parted as if she had been frozen in the middle of a sigh. It was impossible. She should have decayed long ago. But there she was, looking as though she had been buried only yesterday. Bill stumbled backward, his face drained of color. How is this possible?" he whispered. John didn't have an answer. He could only stare at the body, his mind racing. There was something deeply wrong about this, something that defied all logic and reason. And then, as he stood there, staring down at Emily, her eyes snapped open. Before continuing with the next part of the story, please donate through PayPal at LDT Group to help keep the channel running. Your support helps us create more chilling content. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to LDT Group. Part 2. Emily's eyes were wide, pale as the mist that swirled around them. For a long moment, the three men stood frozen in shock, unable to comprehend what they were seeing. Her eyes locked onto John, unblinking, filled with an otherworldly fury that made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. "Run!" Mike screamed, turning and bolting into the mist without a second thought. Bill stood frozen, his eyes glued to Emily's body as it began to twitch, her limbs moving in unnatural jerks as if pulled by invisible strings. "John, what's happening?" Bill whispered, his voice trembling with fear. John didn't answer. He couldn't. His legs felt like they were made of lead, his body rooted to the ground by some unseen force. He watched in horror as Emily's hand slowly reached up, grasping the edge of the coffin with pale, slender fingers. Her movements were stiff, mechanical, but filled with an unnatural strength. She began to sit up. The sound that escaped her lips was not human. It was a low, guttural moan, filled with pain and rage, a sound that echoed through the graveyard and sent shivers down their spines. The mist seemed to thicken around her, swirling like a living thing, wrapping itself around her body as she rose from the coffin. John stumbled backward, his heart pounding in his chest. He had faced spirits before, had encountered things that defied explanation, but this was different. Emily's eyes followed him, filled with a hatred so deep, so consuming, that it seemed to reach into his very soul. "Why?" she whispered, her voice soft but filled with sorrow. John could feel the weight of her question pressing down on him, suffocating him. He didn't know what she wanted, but he knew that they had disturbed something that was never meant to be disturbed. They had crossed a line, and now they would pay the price. To help us continue sharing stories like this, please donate through PayPal LDT Group. Your support is invaluable to our channel. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to LDT Group. John stumbled back, his heart pounding in his chest. Emily's ghostly figure was now fully upright, her body swaying slightly as though caught between life and death. The mist continued to swirl around her, thick and suffocating, wrapping her in an otherworldly shroud. Bill was shaking, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. "We need to go," he shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar of the wind that had suddenly picked up. But John couldn't move. His feet felt rooted to the ground, his mind racing with fear and disbelief. He could only watch as Emily began to move toward them, her steps slow and deliberate, her eyes fixed on him with unrelenting intensity. She raised her hand, reaching out toward him, her fingers pale and ghostly in the moonlight. The mist followed her, swirling around her like a living entity, cold and suffocating. "Please," John whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'm sorry." And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The wind died down. The mist seemed to evaporate, retreating back into the earth from where it had come. Emily's figure flickered for a moment, and then she was gone. The cemetery returned to its eerie stillness, the only sound now the distant rustling of leaves in the breeze. John collapsed to his knees, gasping for air. His body trembled from the intensity of what had just occurred. His mind raced, replaying the terrifying images of Emily's ghost rising from the coffin, her eyes full of rage and sorrow. Bill rushed over to him, his face pale and his breath shallow. "John, what just happened?" John shook his head, still too stunned to respond. They had disturbed something ancient, something that should have remained buried. He had always prided himself on his ability to handle the supernatural, but tonight had shown him that some things were beyond even his understanding. "We never should have done this," John muttered under his breath. "We've crossed a line." Bill nodded in agreement, his hands trembling as he pulled John to his feet. They both stood there for a moment, staring down at the now empty grave, wondering what kind of curse they had unleashed upon themselves. With a heavy heart, John realized that this wasn't the end. Emily's ghost may have vanished, but the feeling of dread that hung over them remained. Something had been disturbed, and it would not rest until justice had been served. As they made their way out of the cemetery, the cold air biting at their skin, John couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He glanced over his shoulder one last time, half expecting to see Emily's ghost lurking in the shadows. But the graveyard was empty, shrouded in the same eerie silence that had greeted them upon their arrival. Thank you for following this terrifying story. Please consider donating through PayPal at LDT Group to support our channel and help us continue creating more spine-chilling tales. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to LDT Group for more haunting stories.